In many empires, power sits on a throne. In Imperial China, power also waited behind a door. And sometimes, the man guarding that door mattered more than every general standing in the open field, every minister arguing in the court, every prince with a claim to the throne. He wasn't any of those things. But he could walk into the emperor's bedroom. He carried sealed orders that no one else was allowed to touch. He stood at the innermost gate of the palace and quietly decided who got through and who waited outside. In modern terms, think of the president's personal aide, his head of security, and his chief of staff, all combined into one person, someone who is always in the room when the doors close. But in ancient China, this kind of person didn't just support power. Sometimes, he became the power, and when that happened, succession could be rewritten and dynasties could fall. These men were called eunuchs. Today, we're going to answer 3 questions. Why did Chinese emperors need them in the first place? How did a figure who looked like a humble palace servant sometimes become the most dangerous man in the empire? And why did this institution, in one form or another, survive for more than 2,000 years, only to vanish completely? Because here's what history keeps showing us. The most dangerous person in an empire isn't always the one commanding an army. Sometimes, it's the quiet man standing by the emperor's door. Let's start not with the body, not with ritual, but with a simpler question. In an absolute monarchy, who is allowed to get close to the emperor? Think carefully about what that question actually means. The emperor is not a president with a 4-year term, not a CEO with a board to answer to. In ancient China, the emperor's body, his bloodline, his private moods, all of it was directly tied to the fate of the entire country. Who he favored today could determine a family's rise or collapse. Who he trusted could decide whether a minister lived or died. Which son he loved most could shape the next dynasty. So the space around the emperor was never just personal space. His bedroom was not an ordinary bedroom. His inner palace was not an ordinary home. And the gates, those gates were not ordinary doors. They were the innermost layer of power itself. And over time, eunuchs became the people allowed to inhabit that space. Here's the most direct reason they existed: the imperial harem. Imagine an emperor looking at his inner palace not as a home, but as the place where the next ruler of China would be born. Every locked gate, every rule, every carefully chosen servant existed to protect one question: whose blood would inherit the throne? In a hereditary empire, power transfers through blood, not through elections. Whoever carries the emperor's bloodline carries a claim to the throne. That meant the emperor had to be absolutely certain about the integrity of that lineage. Any doubt, any whisper could destabilize succession. And a destabilized succession meant civil war, the fall of a dynasty. So the emperor needed a specific kind of person, someone who could move freely through the inner palace, serve the empress, the consorts, the imperial children, be present in the most private spaces imaginable, but not someone who could threaten the bloodline. And that's where the eunuch system began. But eunuchs didn't enter the palace through a single door. Some arrived through punishment castration used as a legal penalty. Some came from desperately poor families, sold or given away with no other option. Some entered because the palace needed men who could serve in spaces where ordinary males were simply forbidden to go. Over time, these scattered individuals became a recognized institution, a defined role inside the imperial machine. The system wasn't born from cruelty alone, it was born from fear. The emperor feared losing control of the inner palace, feared unclear bloodlines, feared that some invisible man might alter the dynasty's future. So he created a category of person who could enter the restricted zone. But here is history's great irony. A system built to reduce risk eventually became a new kind of risk. Once eunuchs entered the palace, they weren't ordinary servants anymore. Think about it this way. A minister wanted to see the emperor? He had to wait for a formal audience, stand in court, speak through ritual and procedure. A general had an army, but he couldn't stand at the emperor's side every day. A prince had bloodline, but even he might not have constant access to his father. Eunuchs were different. When the emperor woke up in the morning, a eunuch might be there. When he ate, when he was sick, when he was angry, afraid, uncertain, suspicious, a eunuch was there. Ministers saw the emperor as a ruler. Eunuchs saw him as a man. They knew when his mood was dark, who he was quietly starting to distrust, which name made him tense, which words would trigger his anger. In the outer court, power was written in titles and rank. Inside the palace, power was hidden in timing, whose memorial reached the emperor first, whose name was mentioned last before the doors closed, whose message was placed on top of the pile, and whose was quietly set aside. A eunuch standing at the gate could decide who the emperor saw that day. He delivered messages and could shift the tone, the order, even the meaning. He passed along official documents and could make one appear first or make another disappear entirely. No official title, no public mandate, but total control over the channel between the emperor and the outside world. The emperor believed eunuchs were safe because they had no family, no heirs, no political base. What he forgot: you don't need sons to hunger for power. The clearest illustration of this danger appears in the final days of the Qin dynasty. Before the empire knew the emperor was dead, a few people near his body already understood that the future could be rewritten. The first emperor of Qin died on a tour of his empire, and in the hours and days that followed, the most critical question wasn't who would fight for the throne, it was who controlled the information. Should the death be announced? When? How should the imperial edict be transmitted? Who would inherit? Which generals at the frontier would receive word, and which would be cut off before they could act? At the center of this crisis stood Zhao Gao, a palace insider remembered in many historical accounts as a eunuch and one of the emperor's closest officials. In the days following the emperor's death, Zhao Gao helped conceal the news, manipulate the succession, and isolate the general and the prince who might have stood in the way. A sealed letter delayed, a messenger sent on a different road, a court order that arrived too late. The man who altered the course of the Qin dynasty did not command thousands of troops. He controlled a few words, a few orders, a few meetings that would or would not happen. He didn't control the battlefield, he controlled the flow of information. And in imperial politics, controlling that flow can be faster and more lethal than any army. So if eunuchs were this dangerous, why didn't emperors simply get rid of them? The reason was not that emperors trusted eunuchs too much. It was that they trusted everyone else even less. Ministers represented institutions, ritual law, ancestral regulations, court procedure. They could advise the emperor, oppose him, use moral authority to constrain him. For an emperor who wanted absolute control, his ministers were sometimes not helpers, they were obstacles. A minister could quote the law back at you. A eunuch couldn't afford to. His entire power depended on the emperor's personal approval, and that made him, in a strange way, the most controllable person in the palace. Or so the emperor believed. Because a eunuch's power had no independent legitimacy, it came entirely from the emperor himself. Take away imperial trust, and the eunuch had nothing. So when an emperor wanted to bypass the court, avoid the ministers, execute something that wasn't convenient to announce openly, eunuchs were the most practical tool available. This is the deepest logic of the eunuch system. They weren't just a loophole in imperial governance. Very often, they were the tool emperors used to get around official governance entirely. By the Ming dynasty, this logic reached one of its most extreme forms. The Ming had a powerful civil bureaucracy, and some emperors increasingly looked for ways to avoid it when they didn't want to sit through daily court sessions. When they didn't want every decision running through official channels, they leaned on the private network closest to them. Eunuchs carried imperial messages, monitored officials, handled sensitive operations that couldn't go through proper channels. An official waiting outside the gate, a sealed command passed through a side door, a court decision made before the ministers were even informed. This was how the inner network operated. And by the early 17th century, a man named Wei Zhongshan showed exactly where that path could lead. Wei Zhongshan was not born into nobility. He did not command armies in his own name. But through the emperor's trust and total control of palace access, he built a network that stretched across the entire state. Officials who opposed him could lose office, lose freedom, or lose their lives. Temples were erected in his honor while he was still alive. For several years, he effectively ran the Ming government not from a throne, but from the shadows behind one. He was eventually destroyed when a new emperor came to power, but his rise reveals the full logic of the danger. When an emperor relies on private agents to bypass public institutions, those agents can grow powerful enough to threaten the emperor himself. And here is the final irony. Eunuchs didn't grow powerful because emperors were weak. Often, they grew powerful precisely because emperors were too determined to keep all control for themselves. We should be careful here, though. Not every eunuch was a schemer. That picture is too simple and too unfair to the real people trapped inside this system. Many came from poverty, with no meaningful choice. Many were produced by the state's punitive machinery rather than by any voluntary path. They lived close to power, and yet they lived far from anything resembling an ordinary life. An ordinary man could start a family, leave something behind, go home. For most eunuchs, the palace was not a ladder to power. It was a wall they never escaped. For every Zhao Gao or Wei Zhongshan remembered by history, there were countless unnamed men whose lives never became power, only service. They served inside that wall, they were shaped by it. And at different moments, they were tools, victims, or both. That's what makes the system genuinely dark. Not that it was strange, but that it was rational. As long as supreme authority concentrated itself in one person's private rooms, there would always be someone created to serve that closed space. And anyone brought that close cannot remain permanently powerless, because proximity to power generates power. So why did the eunuch system finally disappear? Not because it fell out of fashion. The real reason? The world that required it ceased to exist. Even after the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, the old palace world did not vanish overnight. Puyi, the last emperor, remained inside the Forbidden City for over a decade with a reduced court. Eunuchs still walked those halls, moving through rooms that no longer held any real authority, carrying out rituals for a throne that no longer ruled anything. When Puyi was expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, the last institutional shell of that world collapsed. The eunuchs who remained had nowhere left to serve. Some spent their final years in temples and charity homes. The most well-known among them was Sun Yaoting, widely remembered as China's last imperial eunuch. He died in Beijing in 1996. When he died, what disappeared with him was not just a role or a title. It was the last living shadow of a world built around one man's private rooms and the doors that guarded them. In Chinese imperial history, the most important doors were often the quietest ones. The court could argue in daylight, the generals could wait at the frontier. But inside the palace, behind one closed door, a message could be delayed, a prince could be cut off, and a dynasty could begin to die before anyone outside knew anything had changed. Eunuchs had no armies but could influence who sat on the throne. No official mandate but could shape what the emperor heard. No dynasty of their own but could push a dynasty toward ruin. They were not strange anomalies of ancient China. They were produced by the logic of imperial power itself. When a nation places its highest authority inside one person's bedroom, one person's private fears, one person's sealed-off inner world, even the man who carries the message, guards the door, pours the tea, can become someone who changes history. That's the most important thing to understand. It's not an exotic ancient legend. It's a story about doors, about who controls them, about what happens when the person standing closest to power is also the person no one is watching. The closer you stand to power, the less powerful you might look. But sometimes, all you need to do is stand by the door, and that is already more than enough.